My name is Alan Dobb. I'm an agrologist, and I've been doing work for the BC Forage Council. And the topic today, in your handout, it says, or at least on the itinerary, it says profitable export. And I think we haven't really answered that question yet, and that's why we're looking more at calling it forage production and export potential in BC's interior. So I'm basically going to give you an overview of the report and the project that was written, and these are some of the project sponsors and funders. So we had wide support for the project from a broad range of people. And what were the project objectives? The main interest was just looking at the potential opportunities, but also the challenges related to forage export and forage production. And we wanted also to be able to provide information to producers to help with decision making around hay production. And we also wanted to, if we could, comment a little bit about what the impacts might be on other industries, well, other feeding industries in the province if more hay went to export. And why are we doing this? Why were those questions raised? Well, part of it is just that's what the world is, and now the world is touching the central interior in terms of forage. The world's population is increasing. We talk about it a lot, but there's an increased demand for dairy products, particularly. And that's up in the upper right-hand corner there. Those are dairy products from the Middle East, and those are distributed to North Africa and all over. And that's from a farm in Saudi Arabia. And they're pumping groundwater to produce 10 crops of alfalfa a year. And that's not sustainable, and they know it's not sustainable. And here, we have these containers moving all over the globe. And so it's kind of provided an opportunity, and the opportunity is compressing hay. They call it double compression. And that's a Steffen's press. It's made in Oregon, and it's installed in Vanderhoof. That's one of the facilities installed in Vanderhoof. There are now 2 facilities in Vanderhoof that are compressing hay. That bale weighs about 55 pounds, and the presses can be set up to produce different formats depending on what people need on the other end. And that's what you'd call a small package, 55 pounds for hand feeding at dairies and small livestock operations. Sorry if you can't read this too well, but basically we looked at statistics, and then we did a survey of producers in the central interior, looking at forage sales and forage buyers. And we also I visited 8 different processing plants or hay compression plants, and we interviewed exporters and shipping experts and companies. And then we also did some economics, enterprise budgets around hay production for export. And then we had the final report.
Did you say you visited 5 plants?
8, actually.
8. So where else are they located besides Vanderhoof?
There are plants in Alberta, Washington State, and Oregon, and down the coast. There's a lot in California, but mostly on the Western North America.
It's also the same export market. China.
Yeah, we'll get into the exports in detail. We'll start out talking just a little bit about the forage production here, and you've seen maps like this, I'm sure, before. This was the area that we looked at. We looked at the 3 regional districts. We concentrated a lot around Highway 16 and the Vanderhoof area, but this is ALR lands, and we have forage production everywhere here, but you can see it's pretty constrained by the mountains there, and this is a bit, this is rangeland. A lot of this is rangeland on the west side of the Fraser River, so we see it's ALR, but its potential for forage, of course, isn't there. Or I should say cultivated forage. We have native range there. So this is a farm just north of town, and there's a lot of variation in the kind of hay that can be grown and appropriately grown. Jillian talked about alfalfa production in this area, but there are some areas that aren't that suited to alfalfa production because of pH. The pH is too low. And in the clay soils, they hold too much water, and alfalfa doesn't like wet feed. So this is kind of this is a pretty nice crop of hay, typical brome grass and Alsike clover. We do have some nice stands of alfalfa. This is on the West Fraser Road. And so you get down in the southern climates, and in the Vanderhoof area, it's pretty decent for growing alfalfa. This is a breakdown of total forage acres, and it comes from the Agricultural Statistics Census 2011. And you can see there's been a decline actually in forage acres in the caribou, which is kind of interesting, and I think it might be a little bit related to some livestock producers doing a little more extended grazing and actually buying more hay from hay producing areas. And we'll talk a little bit more about how the hay production is distributed in the area. Fort Fraser, Fort George, pretty stable, and you can see like we have well over 120,000 forage acres in the Bulkley, Chaco, and caribou. This is kind of how the distribution of the hay ground or the forage acres, that's how it looks. This is where our forage production is really concentrated. Over 50,000 forage acres in the Vanderhoof area. And that's really why the plants ended up where they are. But this is quite a big production area out here, partly because of its size, but there is also a fair amount of hay production here. And then the other areas, it is a little dependent on how big the area is in terms of how many forage acres it has, but it's a pretty decent distribution. The thing that's been happening, as everyone knows, we're talking a little bit about what's the forage demand in the central interior. And the purple bar is provincial beef cow numbers. That's only beef cows. And even though BSE hit around 2002, it took a while for the inventory to really go down. And at 2011, we were under 200,000 beef cows in the province. And this number has come up just a little bit, but it seems to be going stable out to 2013, 2014. And you can see in the caribou, pretty well all of those have kind of followed, with the exception of Fraser Fort George, maybe have followed the provincial trend and beef cow numbers. But we also looked at sheep, goats, bison, horses. Horses have declined as well during this period. So we wanted to look at all the animals that were potentially taking up forage, and what we found was, again, F has a lot of animals. They have the forage acres, but they have a lot of animals as well. And we call these forage intake units, and that takes into the fact that maybe 5 sheep equals about 1 cow. So we added up all the numbers and got a sense of how many forage intake units there are in each of these census areas. These are the census subdivision areas. So Area K has a lot of cattle and some horses, and we would suspect this is going to be a hay deficit area because, as you saw, they don't have very many forage acres. And this area might be in better balance, and this area maybe has a surplus. We ran some numbers to see what that looked like. I hope this isn't too hard to look at, but it is kind of an important graph. 2001, let me see how I want to explain this. The solid colors reflect the forage yield in the year, so it does take into account what the year was like and how many animals were in the area. And so in 2001 in the caribou, there was a deficit. And in Fraser Fort George, we had a surplus. And in Bulkley, Chaco, there was also a surplus. And this is based on estimating the feeding period and how many pounds of forage all those animals are going to eat. But look at what happens in 2006. We still had the high numbers, and we had a very, very dry year. And it was so dry that there was drought relief. And the province, well, there was hay coming in from Alberta, and there was hay coming in from Washington State. And there was a shortage of hay. And, you know, we could question how this is working, and of course it's all estimated. But, you know, even in Bulkley and Chaco, we had a forage deficit of maybe 50,000 tons. And in the survey, we pick up from truckers how many loads they were pulling in from Washington State during that period. What's also interesting is 2011, because 2011 was a record yield in terms of hay. And also we had that decrease in the livestock numbers. And so we see almost over 100,000 tons of hay surplus. And there's surplus all across the board. And this might be questionable. You get down in 25,000 tons, it depends on, you know, how long the feeding period actually was. And there's quite a variation in the caribou, even in the feeding period, going from, say, lower along the Fraser to up on the Chilcotin Plateau. So quite a bit of variation, but it gives you a pretty decent idea of the supply and demand through that period. So we do have a hay surplus, and we're likely to have one going forward. But what about the weather? And when we talk about export, we'll get into it a little bit more, but for export forage, it's about quality. So what are the impacts of weather? Because we're in Quesnel today, I put the Quesnel, they call it a Walter Leith diagram, and it's the 30-year average climate information. So we have precipitation in the blue, and we have the average daily high and the average daily low. And that's over a 30-year period, and we updated it to 2010. So it's the most recent data. And what you notice is, look at, you know, and we know every year is different, but look at the amount of rainfall, well over 2 inches in this June, July period. It's a tremendous growing period. But for quality, it's also when you want to be trying to put up export hay. So I also put the Vanderhoof in there, and I just wanted you to show you how that changes. So you can kind of see the difference between Quesnel and Vanderhoof, and we did Prince George and Williams Lake as well. But this might hurt your eyes, hopefully not, but we wanted to look at what's happening in every year in Vanderhoof. So we looked at detail the Vanderhoof weather station data, and we'll talk about 2011. It's a good example. I want you to look for the green bar in this weather series, and these are the summer growing months and harvest months. That green bar represents 400 to 450 growing degree days. And the growing degree day is the average temperature in the day above 5 degrees. And you add those all up for that from January 1 to that period. But what's important about that number is that's really the stage where alfalfa's just in bud, just before bloom, which is the key cutting time for quality. So you can see how that moves around, but what you can also see is where it is in terms of, there's a rainy period, rain, rain, rain. Oh, I'm sorry, blue is rain, yellow is open. And rain is, I think, is more than 5 mils. Oh, and then, no, it's 1 mil or more of precipitation. That's not effective rainfall, but it might impair harvest. The other thing we have here is 2011. These are percent of the monthly average, so 231% of the monthly average. And that was the wet year. So when we compared this chart to what the producers told us how that 2011 year went, there was only 2 windows of harvest, one in August and one in September.
So the export market's wanting to, I mean, you wanted to harvest, you know, as you said before, it flowered, whatever, kind of greenhorn up this stuff. So what if you end up having to wait till a little later? I mean, your quality was down, price go down?
Your quality depreciates, your yield goes up, so the curves kind of cross, your yield curve goes up. And for cow hay, like we've been talking about the domestic market, and that's predominantly what people need hay for here. And so it's a good system. It's just that the plants have come in and there's this opportunity. And so what do we do with it? How do we capitalize on that opportunity? So that's what we're trying to discuss here. 2012 was a tremendous year for hay in Vanderhoof. And so I don't know how much it had to do with the plants and their decisions to invest, but we had tremendous yield, and then 2012 was a quality year. And so we had both reasonable yield and quality. But 2013 wasn't so great in the Vanderhoof area. We'll talk about that. What about the weather? This is a alfalfa stand just 2 kilometers from the Vanderhoof weather station. So we have a pretty good idea what it looked like. So on June 18th, when the photo was taken, this field was approaching to be ready for harvest for export quality. It was cut a few days later, and because of rain, they didn't bale it until the first week of July, and that's what the sample turned out. So crude protein, 12%, moisture, 12%, just under 12%, which is what you need. Crude protein, just about 16, and the relative feed value of 126. The relative feed value is a measurement they use for alfalfa, and it equates to 100 being equivalent to full bloom alfalfa in terms of its how much the dry matter intake and its nutritional value. So it's a bit of an index for measuring alfalfa.
So the ideal is right around where that is, or 100%?
No, this is under export quality, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. This did not meet export quality.
So it didn't go.
It didn't go. So then there's Timothy too. Timothy is the other important export crop. And here's another, well, we'll start up here. And you can see the differences in phenology. This is all taken the same year. And these slides, because of the light in here, aren't that great. But this was an export field taken June 5th in Moses Lake. And this one is Olds, Alberta. Interestingly, Olds has similar total precipitation in the year as Vanderhoof. But the average temperatures are colder, and I suspect the Timothy phenology is later at Olds than it is here at Quesnel. I put this slide in to show you this isn't a managed stand particularly. It's not going to make export quality because there's quack grass in it, and we'll talk about that in a bit. I put this slide in because it gets a little confusing, the domestic market, but it's really about supply and demand and transportation and quality of forage. This is leek. This guy's going after the leek on the back of the bicycle, but in the survey we did pick up some hay prices, and these are priced freight on board in Vanderhoof. And so there is some dairy quality hay being produced in Vanderhoof, and the first slide where you saw square bales, big square bales in the warehouse, that producer has been producing for the dairy market down in the Lower Mainland. But you can see some of the prices, and that 2011 hay, some of it was going for $30 a ton, and it was still being sold at 2012 and 2013. And so we saw a variation, and of course horse hay. What I wanted to say about this is it depends where the hay is. This is on Vancouver Island. That's roughly $400 a ton. And it's in a package on a pallet, and so people can take it away. So you have a horse market that needs hay, so it's in demand. They can charge, it's not bad hay for grass hay, $10 a bale. And those bales out of Fort Fraser, they're being trucked somewhere. And so it's all about transportation. So we put this together to show the transportation costs. And so we used Vanderhoof as the center, and we priced everything per ton out of Vanderhoof. And so for somebody, like we picked up a hay sale down here, just south of Cache Creek to a ranch there. So by the time that Vanderhoof hay gets down there, it's worth $130 a ton. And it's all because of trucking. And this,
so when you say, like, say Clinton, $65, so it's $65 to ship it from Vanderhoof
yeah,
to Clinton.
a ton. And this is based on no backhaul. So that means the truck is taking hay, delivering it to a ranch or a farm somewhere and going back empty.
I just want to make sure, so that's in just transportation plus hay cost together? Yeah.
This is transportation only. That's truck freight only. But this is an important map for anybody thinking about export forage, even if you can produce the quality required, getting it to Vanderhoof. So just go backwards. You've got to get the hay to the plant. So where we do have some production areas in Williams Lake, $46 a ton to get it up there. And if you're producing that quality of hay in Williams Lake, you want to be a hay producer. What about going down here?
Forget about it.
Well, no. What it shows is that, yeah, and we'll show you in a bit, the truck freight,
Oh, right, yeah.
the truck freight to Abbotsford is roughly,
$37, right?
that's $102 a ton, but it's almost identical to the freight to ship to China. We'll look at that in a minute. So forage export is very much just like the domestic market. It's about the supply and the demand, transportation and logistics, and customer relationships. This is in Ellensburg. It's a big facility, and that's a fumigation shed. And this is the scale that they're operating on in that area.
Where's Ellensburg?
It's in Washington State, in the center of the state. And it's really about the scale of the acres and the size of the farms and their weather.
So a fumigation shed, they're spraying it for bugs as
They're
well?
spraying it to meet phytosanitary requirements, and it's mostly for the Hessian fly. And we'll talk about that.
Can you shoot on it?
I think it's a bromide, but I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up. Anyway, these are the hay importing countries, and it started in Japan with their dairy industry in the late 70s, and it started out as a dehydration industry. But with the shipping containers that are going around the world, they're now taking long fiber hay, and nearly 2.5 million tons, this is metric tons, of hay. South Korea has been huge, and the United Arab Emirates, look at down here, they put in a water policy where they're trying to get away from pumping groundwater for their alfalfa. And so they've created a program to buy hay for all kinds of animals, not just dairy animals. So their demand has gone way up. That's 2012 up here. But China is what everybody's been talking about, and you can see where they've gone. Like down here in 2008, they didn't hardly have anything, and now they're up here over 600,000 tons imported. Canada, we're not exporting that. Most of what's exported comes out of Alberta, southern Alberta. And I think we're up to, let's see, 2012. Oh yeah, if you add these all up, Canada's total exports maybe just over 500,000 ton. And I wanted to give you some China figures too. We're going to look at the United States. The United States, because of their irrigation and because of their dry climates in the western basin states, they are supplying most of the world's export forage. And you can see their China numbers here. I'll just give them to you. Exports to China, 2008, 19,000 ton. By 2012, they were up to 483,000. Canada's exports in 2012, only 772 ton. like just 772 ton. But by 2013, we were already up to 5,541. This is the hay program I mentioned in the United Arab Emirates, and this is a big bale sleeve, they call it. It's a compressed, double compressed bale, weighs about 1,000 pounds. And what's interesting about this is for Bedouin. This is like slightly lower quality forage, and it's going to sheep, goats, and camels. And what's interesting is there's a whole issue around the marketing of this hay. And often these bigger bales are used for total mixed rations. So there may be some question about where this hay actually ends up. But it's a huge amount of hay that's going out. And this Eldara Agriculture, a big corporation in the United Arab Emirates, just bought out one of the major processors in the United States. And what that means is it kind of closes and tightens the market for forage into the lower quality sheep and goat camel market. So you were asking about what's the quality level that people are looking for. In China right now, the minimum percentage is crude protein 18% and the relative feed value 140. So still pretty decent quality. Japan, they import a lot of Timothy for their dairy cattle for dietary fiber. And they like Timothy because they've grown it for a long time on their island, their northern island. And here we have some information about the United Arab Emirates hay program. So a little lower quality, but you know, maybe that stuff I showed you early might squeak into that program. But then you have the marketing issue of how to get it into that stream when that market is largely cornered by a huge multinational integrated chain. That company also looks for hay and they buy hay independently, so there might be some way to link into that market. So we also mentioned what's required in terms of quality. These are the phytosanitary requirements, and these are issued by the country where the hay is going to. And then the CFIA in Canada has agreements they have what they call the Canadian Hay Certification Program. And what that does is it basically, they approve or license in a way. I don't think they call it a license, but they officially sanction facilities to produce for these different countries, and then they produce a certificate for phytosanitary requirements. Japan and Korea is pretty straightforward. The Hessian fly is the big one though, because the hosts for that are, you can see, wheat, barley, rye, couch grass. So that's a pretty key thing, and you can cut around it. If you've got a patch, if you manage for it, you could cut around it, or you can mark a bale. But if you get any of that in a shipment and it ends up over there, it gets shipped back at a cost to the exporter. And so that's why it's really a business. It's a serious business. And so we'll talk a little bit about what might be required for that.
It seems amazing that the requirements are so stringent if they're so desperate for hay over there that wouldn't be, you know.
Well, it's hard to say. There's probably some testing of the market in terms of where the world price can be set. And we don't know, the drought in California that's on right now could have an effect on hay prices. So it's really a world phenomenon. And when the price of corn went up, the price of alfalfa in California and Washington State also went up, because you get feed substitution in the dairy industry, and so everything is affected.
Now that the price of corn has gone down, did alfalfa?
I haven't actually picked this up to find that out, but we might suspect that that's the case. But then the drought in California would put a shortage on alfalfa, and you still need your fiber, and it all depends on how the feeds can be substituted. Another part I didn't mention is Australia and Spain are the other big forage exporters, and Australia produces oaten hay, and oaten hay also goes to Japan and Korea. And so it depends on what their crop does of how the prices are affected.
You'd also be competing with soy meal out of South America for the dairy.
For sure, the protein side of it comes in when they formulate the rations. And so if they can make up what they need with a little more protein, depending on what the price is, they can do it that way, get less from alfalfa, feed more dietary fiber. I wanted to show you this because this is the same Walter Leaf diagram for Moses Lake, Washington, which is in the central, well, it's the basin, they call it the Columbia Basin region of Washington. It's very dry. It used to be a dry desert grassland. And an irrigation project went in there in the 50s. Nearly 1 million acres irrigated, I think. No, 500,000. And annual rainfall just over 9 inches. And remember that blue? Look at this right here, June, like 10, yeah. But they still get the variations, and perhaps with climate change, they're having a little more erratic spring. So when I was there in June 2013, their first cut alfalfa, not so good. And Timothy actually didn't turn so good either. And that's when the Washington State crop goes off, and it's not good, they'll go to Alberta, they'll go anywhere looking for better quality Timothy.
What is premium Timothy?
Premium Timothy is long head, green, not in the anesthesis, leafy. It's based on color, mostly.
What is anesthesis?
The flower stamens are out of in the head of the
When the
Timothy.
Timothy head opens up, basically.
Like I said, I'm complete green, or I'm just looking to get into this somewhat.
And so I just put this in to show this is the scale issue, and just systems have been developed in Washington State, but it's instructive to look at it, because if we're going to adapt in a changing environment to doing some export, we need to look at these systems to see what we can learn. A lot of their hay gets put up at the side of the field, and so some of the exports, one of them that I know, buys hay off the field. And this is a good way because they go and sample the stack. They know what they're buying. And this is in contrast to what happened in Vanderhoof, and maybe we'll have time to talk about it if there is time. What's interesting is they know their customers are used to buying compressed hay, so they cut out this little square. They have a press in the back of their pickup, and they press the hay to make it look as if it was compressed in the big machine, so their buyers know exactly what it looks like. So that's just a small thing, but it's big for customer relations. This is just a Timothy swath, but this is the kind of equipment that they have to get it off the field quick, because when you put up these big 4x4x8 bales, they can't be out at all. They need to be in because moisture has to be 12% or less, and they can pick up moisture really easy. So they take the square sample, and then they create this stack evaluation sheet. So you can see the stack name, and they have their own grading system that their customers get used to. And they grade the stem size, texture, color, and whether rain and leaf retention. So they have this all scaled out for their customers. And then they have this analysis sheet attached, and this one was first cut alfalfa, 20% protein and 150 relative feed value. TDN was 63. And they have relationships with their buyers, and the buyers come over and they look at the crops in the field. And this is happening in Vanderhoof. There was a group from Japan that came to Vanderhoof last fall. This is not turning out, but this is a scale. This is just hay going up. And I was going to ask you to count the balers, but it's pointless because they're pretty hard to see. But there was 7 or 8 working in that field, and there's 5 in the photo. And we're not going to be at that scale, but we do have to think about the speed that we put the harvest up, because if we have those short windows, this is a lot of numbers, but there's some important ones here. We did this is the freight rate analysis. So what has to happen is the hay is compressed in Vanderhoof. It gets put into the container at the plant. It gets trucked to Prince George. And these containers are 40 foot, and they hold approximately 27 tons, short tons of hay. So it costs to truck to Prince George to the container terminal, costs $550, $551 for the trucking alone. It gets on the train, takes 2 weeks or more to get to Prince Rupert. And we had to kind of fetter out what the freight rate was, because CN Rail didn't want to talk to us at all, which is no surprise really. They have big customers and they don't want to talk to you. But when we go to the shipping companies, it's pretty well all in. So you get a rate from the container yard in Prince George, and you get the rate to wherever you're going. We figured out the freight rate by pricing at the container yard in Prince Rupert and taking the difference between container yard Prince Rupert and container yard Prince George, and it's $900. That's the rail freight for that one container. So basically you add it all up, and we did this on a short ton basis. And so to go to Shanghai, remember what I said about Abbotsford? $102, the low price.
Same that it was to Abbotsford, 102 on that map.
So there's a real crossover in terms of where the hay could go. If you start producing that quality of hay, your marketing has got to shift. You have options, really. And in real terms, there's not all that. I mean, think about going all the way to the UAE, and it's in real terms, it's not that, the freight's not that different. I didn't know how much time we'd have and how much was too much information, but in terms of on a competitive basis, it basically goes like this in terms of cost. Prince Rupert, Vancouver, Seattle, Tacoma, Long Beach, California, Long Beach, LA. Long Beach, LA has the most containers of anywhere in North America. So this is, if you take 900 from that price, you get 1,200. That's the cost of just the ocean freight to go from Prince Rupert to Shanghai. Guess what it is out of Long Beach, California?
$200.
Close. $260.
And yet they're going farther.
They're going farther. And here's the other thing.
Is that just because of the sheer volume? Why is it so much cheaper?
Yeah, well,
Lots of empty containers there.
lots of empty containers. So what's interesting is there's a hay exporter in Olds, that Timothy field that we saw. They are able to, they're at a bit of a disadvantage compared to Vanderhoof in terms of the sea freight, because they have to go to Vancouver by rail or some other port. But what's happening is they're right on Highway 2 between Edmonton and Calgary. And the refrigerator trucks that go to Edmonton and Calgary to deliver produce from California will go back to California with a load of hay, compressed hay from Alberta. And it goes to a plant, and there's some plants that do processing right at Long Beach, California. It's set up right there. So it's very interesting how it all works. We did a detailed budget trying to get a sense of for our processors, our producers in Vanderhoof or anywhere else, of just what you might expect, or what is it costing to do all this, and what might that indicate that the exporter can pay the farmer for the hay. So what we did, because this is kind of the model that's being used, because there's a limited large-scale baling capacity. You need the large-scale bales to go into the compressor. The exporters in Vanderhoof are both running balers to bale farmers' hay. So we put $20 in for that cost, and then we just go through all the costs. We got inbound freight, that's trucking from the field to the plant. The pressing charge is how much it costs to press the bale in the plant. And this $50 is going to be the tough number, and we got it a little bit by looking at that number in the United States, but of course they have volume. Vanderhoof is struggling for volume, so their pressing costs could even be, they're likely going to be higher than that. And labor, and it's likely to be a bit more. And then there's other costs that we need to attach, the broker costs and insurance. Remember I mentioned about the ship back? You need insurance definitely to go to China. So $2 a ton, so you add all this up. Outbound freight, that's the trucking to Prince George. There's the ocean and rail freight. Other miscellaneous letter of credit, that's a financial institution instrument to make sure that you get your money as an exporter. Because if you don't get your money, you're not going to be in business very long. And so when we add up all those costs and we followed 2 shipments. One went to China and one went to Japan. This just met the limit for China in terms of quality. The 18%, it was even a little less than 140 relative feed value. And that was number 1 Timothy to Japan. And it was on a short ton basis that these numbers. So when you, that's the imperial ton, 2,000 pounds.
Versus a metric ton.
Actually, it isn't the imperial ton, it's American ton. American ton is 2,000 pounds, and the metric is 2,200 pounds. Ton.
So, what was I gonna ask? I just had a question.
So when you add up, you take away that landed price and you take all the costs off, what does that reveal at the end? It reveals for alfalfa nearly $100 a ton, and for Timothy about 193. So what do you think the contract price in Vanderhoof was last year? What do you think they were?
$90 a ton to pay you on the field?
$90 a ton on the field.
So they come and cut it, because they have to use their baler, they come and bale it. Then what about shipping from your field to their pressing?
That
factory?
$10, they were paying for that.
They were paying.
Yeah. So you can see they were pretty, the reveal price is pretty close, and we picked up a price of 180 of Timothy in the swath, right?
So why does Timothy get so much more?
Because the demand in Japan
Just Japan mainly?
and Korea,
Why? They want that for their cows? Just
yeah,
what is the
for their
big
dairy
deal?
cows.
What's the difference? Like, why is
We have to go to Japan and ask them.
Maybe
I know what the
the
answer
Kobe
is,
beef,
but
they want the Timothy for their
it's a bit cultural, and the whole thing about the long heads is,
Okay.
I've heard all kinds of things, but we should go talk to
Something
them.
do with their
maybe the
traditions.
taste and
Yeah,
too.
for sure. Yeah, for sure.
It's gonna be different.
So, it's really about the land and where we are in the climate. This is just showing all the variables.
Oh, I know what my question was, sorry. Go ahead. I was just gonna ask about, how long does it take to ship, and what about your total feed value when it gets to the other side? They test it pre and then test it post-shipping.
It'll hold. The big thing is the moisture, and
Is it a 2-week journey, or?
no, it's longer than that.
Is it?
It takes 2 weeks to get from Prince George to Prince Rupert, so it's gonna take longer.
Yeah,
to get
I
from
think it's
Rupert.
6
Yeah.
weeks or better.
And then from Rupert to China, 6
Um,
weeks, wow.
But you have to have 12% or less because it'll heat, and it goes over in a humid country, it'll spoil.
How do you think this is all gonna change when it comes to the agreement with dairy and between Europe and Canada?
Geez, I haven't even thought about that
Right,
equation.
like there's lots more to think about than just this, because that's all based on what market values are and things, and what the markets are gonna do in the future. So,
It's true. It's really true. And that wasn't on it's interesting how much has changed. This report, I finished it just at the end of the year, last year. And you think there's drought in California, there's pending changes in the dairy industry with European Union, and that was on the horizon, but it wasn't really in our purview at the time. But they're really good questions.
So you're suggesting maybe that'll be good for Canadian producers or not? You know, as far as the demand for Canadian.
Well, it could change the price, how the price is relative to the product, based on what happens with Europe.
Well,
I think.
this opens up a lot more, like the cost of milk and dairy is supposed to go down, right? So there might be places like the EU and stuff like that that choose not to get their milk from their own production because it's gonna be cheaper to buy it
Right,
somewhere else,
right.
right? So then the market on hay is gonna go down. So potentially. So we can either choose to go into dairy or go into hay. Your choice.
So one of the things that we tried to look at when we went to Alberta was they've adapted to some extent, and that's hard to look at, isn't it? Look at, it's like a,
So what are they?
what are they doing there?
Bales and put in the square?
Yeah, this is a plant near Peace River, near Saint Isidore, and they've been in business a long time. So they're in a northern climate, they're a long way away from shipping, and they do almost exclusively Timothy. And there are some lower markets in Timothy for Japan, and I think this is where they're hitting. But what they do to broaden their window is they built a dryer, and they also allow, instead of limiting to large square bales, they take round bales, and there's waste, but everyone around has a round baler. So, and it works not, there's some waste, but it works not too bad for what they're doing. So the round bales come up the conveyor, they get unwrapped, and they go down this drying rack. You see it there, it's a long, there's like about 6 big buildings ventilating. It's like a big furnace system, and so it takes about 2.5 minutes for the hay to go through, and it'll go down from 16 down to 12% moisture. At the end of the conveyor, it gets rebaled into 3-tie square. From 3-tie square, it goes into the compressor and comes out in whatever format. They have small bale formats there too. So that's one adaptation, natural gas fired. And there'd be economics around that. So they're not going to be paying as much at the field for that Timothy because they're drying it down, comes in at 16%. This is
Does it affect the protein though? Like, it doesn't affect it at all?
not, and
Drying?
this would be Timothy again, so it's more in the color and leaf and that kind of thing. So there might be some leaf loss in the Timothy when they pull apart the round bales, but overall, probably better some than none is how they're running. This is the plant in Olds. It's a new addition that they put on. They got this dehydrator from an old alfalfa dehy plant, and they refigured it to dry alfalfa hay. So this is coming in these big square bales at maybe 16 to 18%. And they even have some as high as 20 that they've put in plastic wrap to keep it. And so it goes taken apart, it goes through this system. It's high tech because it has to be cooled down, or there's, fires, that fire hazard is fairly high. And then it comes out this conveyor and it gets baled into 4x8 big baler.
Is the Hessian fly a concern with any of these plants like it is?
It
in
is everywhere. It is everywhere.
Do they spray like they do in Washington?
No, Canada doesn't have any spraying. And I think we could. I forget exactly. I think there is one country, maybe it is Japan, but it costs money. And the thing about Washington State, they can do a lot of it in the summertime, and they just put it in the container, seal it up. But in the wintertime, they have a big heated building. And so that's a climate thing again. So for us to do it here, we'd have to have a big building and
That's added cost.
added costs. So what are the strengths of the area? Well, we have 2 processing plants in Vanderhoof now. quite significant investments. Like they have storage, they have the equipment. This is the other one. This is Machaco Valley Agri Enterprises. And interestingly enough, this plant came from, guess where? Peace River. Peace River, Alberta. It was running alfalfa and it didn't succeed. Went out of business. But it's interesting, the Timothy plant running dryer succeeded. So we've got forage production knowledge and capacity and reasonable shipping by Canadian standards out of Prince Rupert. But the weaknesses are fairly significant right now. Weather and currently insufficient volume of export quality forage. And the one plant in particular, it's pretty hard to go inside and say, how's your business this year? But they were very helpful and gave us pretty good information. Top hay concentrated on China, and a lot of the hay they got in this year won't meet or didn't meet that quality cutoff. So what we thought in the report, would this mean we'd see big square bales coming in the hay market? I learned from a producer in the Caribou that they got their first load of big square bales this year. So we'll see more of that. So that's one of the impacts downstream.
So what do they do then? And you're saying you get it to their plant from off the field and they test it or whatever? I mean, and then it doesn't meet standards, so then what? What happens to all that hay?
It's an issue with contracting. They contracted at the field with the farmer for $90 a ton in the swath. The exporter has the risk then of it being in the swath, and they've paid the price, $90 a ton. So weather, bad weather, poor quality hay doesn't meet export. So then how are you going to get your $90 back and some profit, hopefully, out of that hay? So this is why, if anybody's interested in the report, I can get it to you, but we talk about marketing strategies. Everybody has to become a marketer. If you're going to be in the forage business, doesn't matter what kind of hay.
Well, see, that's what, I just happened to bump into someone, I don't know if they're here today, but someone lives in Vanderhoof, and they were saying, yeah, a friend of ours had, I don't know, like 5,000 acres, and they sold to top hay. And, $90 contract, and then they cut it, and they didn't get to it to bale it, because they only have 4 balers, and then it was rained on. Next thing you know, this guy told me, well, now it's only worth $40 a ton. But who's buying it, and where's it going for 40 a ton? I don't know.
Well, remember, it's
Like
about the exporter's going to make how they're going to get their money out of it. That's the issue of keeping those guys in business, right? I mean, that's the tipping point, is the processing and how they're buying it. So these are weaknesses, and they need 20,000 tons a year. If you talk to the exporters for these plants, the size they are, they need, maybe they can run with 12. But getting 12,000 tons of exportable forage, 2 of them, not just 1, 2, is fairly significant. We have the surplus forage. We went back to the beginning. We have the surplus forage, but it's the quality of that forage. So there are some opportunities, adaptation in drying and processing, accepting round bales instead of square, some modifications, because you can spread some location diversification. Somebody might have missed a shower that affected quality, and so you could spread your web a little bit more, but the big baler is an expensive piece of equipment. So if you got one, you got to have the acres. And so we're suggesting buying, sharing, co-ops, loans. I mean, if the plants are there, it's probably going to be a positive thing for the forage industry, for people to renovate their stands. That's the other thing that we're suggesting. I'll get to it in a second, but we need more knowledge out there about the export market and what people need to produce to. And then we have verticillium wilt. That came up this fall in Vanderhoof. And so not only was the weather an issue, for China to go to alfalfa, you have to have a field inspection, so you have to go out and walk it when it's growing. And then you have to do a lab test for verticillium wilt. And this year it was detected in Vanderhoof, and nobody really thought it was there. They thought it was Quesnel and up the river a bit, but nobody really thought it was in Quesnel or Vanderhoof.
So what is that?
Yeah, it's in a lot of different things, and once it gets in, it's hard to get rid of. And there are resistant varieties, but they still can have a little bit of the disease. So those are the threats. And so we're really talking again about adaptation, and it's really about developing a strategy, because we can grow forage, it's just, and we can get it dry, it's just, it's going to be lower quality. So maybe trying to develop a lower quality market. But again, will the numbers work out? And then there's other issues that came up, like nodulation in alfalfa. We're not getting the benefits of growing alfalfa because there's low nodulation in areas.
Can you explain that? I don't know what that means.
Well, there's rhizobium bacteria that are in nodules of alfalfa and legume plants, and they take nitrogen out of the air, put it into the soil. And that's one of the major reasons that we grow alfalfa and legume crops in rotations, because they're very valuable as green manure. And so we're not getting the full benefits, and we maybe have alfalfa in places where we shouldn't have, where it's too acidic. And so it's interesting, Top Hay is also putting in a limestone processing facility. They've invested a lot of money there. And again, we don't really know the economics of that, of raising the pH. There's been some work done on it, and there's a little bit talked about in the report. So these are the kind of supporting activities that we're trying to look at, and discussions that I think need to happen particularly between the exporters and the producers. So that's pretty well the end. I have some information on economics, but I think I've probably taken up all the time.